Hello students, let's discuss the respiratory system in humans.
It begins from the nose here and ends at the alveoli in the lungs. Let us get introduced to each part in detail. First comes the upper respiratory tract. It consists of the nasal cavity, the pharynx and the larynx. Let's commence with studying the complete nasal cavity. If we zoom into the structure, we find that the nasal chamber looks somewhat like this. It mainly has three regions or parts. This is the part we're all familiar with, the nose. Any idea what the openings are called as? Yes, they're called as nostrils. The nostrils, also called as nares, are these openings. Just as the nasal chamber within commences, we have the first region called the vestibule. This region bears tiny hair-like structures which serve different purposes. Any guesses what functions the vestibule region will have? The region has a lining of mucus that helps trap any foreign particle which enters through the inhaled air. Also, the hair in this region expel the trapped particles out with rhythmic movement. So the vestibule region has all the arrangements to defend the bacteria or other harmful particles that may try entering the system with the inhaled air. The next region following this is the respiratory region. This region usually serves many different functions. Most importantly, it warms the air to get it to the normal body temperature. Then it moistens it to make it suitable for the body. And lastly, it helps send some air to the third nasal chamber and push the remaining air forward into the next part of the respiratory tract. Now, what do you think the third chamber would do with the air? Well, the name olfactory says it all. The region is responsible for the sense of smell. It contains highly sensitive cells which send the received signal to the brain and help in identifying the smell. Post the nasal chamber comes the next part called the pharynx. This is like a common connection between the respiratory and the digestive tract. And why do we say so? Well, as you can see here, this acts like a common passage between the nasal chamber on the top and the windpipe and the food pipe just lying below it. The pharynx is also further divided into three parts. The nasopharynx, which is the continuation with the nasal chamber. Oropharynx, the one that lies behind the oral cavity. This is the central region. And lastly, we have the laryngopharynx, which is the last region connecting to the next part, that is the larynx. What do you think is the pharynx important for? Well, apart from receiving food and air from the respective zones, the pharynx performs one of the most crucial tasks. Imagine what will happen even if a small amount of food enters the respiratory tract by mistake. Apart from the discomfort caused, it will be a serious concern. But how does the food know the way to the food pipe each and every time? How doesn't the food accidentally enter the windpipe? Well, that's taken care of by the pharynx. Do you notice a small flap here? This flap, named the epiglottis, falls over to cover the surface below when the food enters the system. As a result, the opening of the windpipe gets covered and the food strictly passes into the esophagus. The presence of the epiglottis makes the pharynx an extremely important part of the system. Now next on the list is the larynx. The last part of the upper respiratory tract is also known as the voice box. Now this name talks about its significance. Is this responsible for creating the voice that we have? Yes, the larynx is involved in the sound production. And how does it produce sound exactly? Well, the voice box has lateral folds somewhat like this. Now imagine air to pass through these folds. When they're open, nothing really great can be noticed. But now, when they are closed and when air passes through them, then the folds vibrate. And this gives rise to sound. And that's how the sound is produced by the voice box. The larynx is just a small box-like structure, but in adults, it just protrudes slightly. It becomes more prominent in males after puberty. And this bulging structure in the throat is called the Adam's apple. Well, these three components make up the upper respiratory tract: the nasal cavity, the pharynx, and the larynx. Now let's have a glance at the parts of the lower respiratory system. As the air passes down the larynx, it has to travel far, crossing many junctions in between. The first junction is the trachea. This is also called the windpipe. This is a slender muscular pipe that lies just below the larynx. It usually makes up the throat region and extends till the fifth thoracic vertebra. Post this, it gets divided into two branches. The trachea is surrounded by rings of cartilage. It is the hyaline cartilage that surrounds the windpipe, which gives both strength and flexibility to the tracheal muscles. If the structure is observed from the dorsal view, then the cartilage rings are found to be incomplete. That is, they are C-shaped and do not form a complete ring-like structure. This helps in easy contraction of the muscles when the food is passed down the esophagus, lying just behind the trachea. At the point where the trachea is about to terminate, it's the next junction that arrives. This is called the bronchus. As we can see here, bronchus acts like the entry point in the lungs. It gets divided into two branches called the right main bronchus and the left main bronchus. Which is the right and which is the left, by the way? Well, here we're referring to the structures with respect to the human body that has this system. In other words, if this individual is standing in front of you, then this is the right and this is the person's left side. Similarly here, this is the right and this is the left main bronchus. Getting back, the bronchi enter the respective lungs to get further divided into bronchioles. Now before we talk about the lungs and the surrounding protective case, let's continue with the bronchioles and their terminal structures. The bronchioles are these smaller root-like structures that are present inside the lungs. These ultimately lead to the bundles of these tiny sacs. Any idea what are these structures that appear like cluster of grapes? Well, these sacs form the basic units of the respiratory system. They are the actual sites of the gaseous exchange. That is, the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood occurs in the alveoli. One single ball like this one is called the alveolus. Any idea why these alveoli have these several spherical ball-like structures? Why isn't a single alveolus a complete ball? Well, many smaller balls help in increasing the surface area. Imagine this single ball. Suppose it has a surface area of x meters squared. Now, if the same volume is occupied by 25 smaller balls, it's obvious that the surface area will increase by many folds. Similarly, here as well, the number of smaller structures make sure that the surface area increases and the maximum surface gets available for the gaseous exchange. If we zoom in to see a single alveoli, we find that the cluster is richly supplied with blood capillaries. A cross-sectional view of a single alveolus helps us understand that it's very thin and composed of a single-celled membrane. The extremely thin membrane helps in very easy exchange of gases between the alveolus and the RBCs flowing through the capillaries. The process of gas exchange occurs via diffusion. So oxygen that has come to this alveolus gets diffused across the membrane and is grabbed by the RBCs. Once this is done, the carbon dioxide also gets into the alveoli via diffusion. And this carbon dioxide travels back the complete tract to reach the nostrils and move out of the body. This is how the gaseous exchange occurs in each alveoli. Now that we know how the components of the respiratory system present inside the lungs work,
have you observed the movement of our chest region or belly when we breathe? That slight inward and outward movement. Why does that happen? Well, breathing is a physical mechanism of taking in air and exhaling it out of the body. This process involves two main steps. The first step is inhalation or inspiration. This is a physical mechanism of taking in air. The diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscular tissue that separates the chest cavity and the abdominal cavity. During inhalation, the diaphragm flattens, making more space for the lungs in the chest cavity. The ribs further move upwards and outwards. It is due to this the ribs are not sealed bones but a cage-like structure having gaps to provide space to expand. All these increases the volume of the lungs, decreasing its pressure. The decreased pressure draws air inside the lungs. The outside air is at a higher pressure, hence rushes inside the body to equalize the same. The reverse situation occurs when we breathe out. The diaphragm relaxes and returns back to its normal dome shape. The ribs contract. As a result, the volume inside the lungs reduces, increasing the pressure inside. The pressure outside is now low. The air inside the lungs now rushes outside to equalize the pressure. Thus, we breathe out. This process of breathing out air is called exhalation or expiration. Our lungs can hold a maximum of 6,000 ml of air anytime, which is called the total lung capacity. That's quite a number, isn't it? Now tell me, is breathing a voluntary or involuntary movement? Can we control it? Let's try. Hold your breath. Oof, that's difficult. The breathing movements are normally not under our control or will. That is, they are involuntary movement. But to some extent, one can cautiously control the rate of breathing. Did you know that in normal human adults, breathing rate is 12 to 18 breaths per minute? But a newborn breathes 60 times per minute. the composition of the air that we inhale and exhale to vary. We often say that we breathe in oxygen and release out carbon dioxide. So, does the air has only two components? Is it practically possible for us to filter out and inhale only oxygen? No, right? The air that we breathe in has other constituents as well, but the proportion of oxygen is comparatively more. Hence, it is oxygen rich. Similarly, the air that we exhale out too has some amount of oxygen, but it is now carbon dioxide rich. So now we know that there is a lot happening within the body when we simply breathe.